Hi, Sam.
Hi, Hannah. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very good myself.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of the first topics that you and I ever talked to each other about.
Yeah. I think from our very first date together, it was clear that we were going to be having many topics and conversations revolving around sociology.
Yeah, and in particular, what we talked about a lot on that first date was disability rights and fat acceptance, and your thoughts on those things based on your background as a pharmacist, as a care provider, as a student of philosophy, and as somebody who grew up in a certain cultural background that I found utterly fascinating.
Yeah, we definitely came to each other from opposite backgrounds. I come from a conservative political and religious background, whereas I would say that you came from a more progressive, community-focused background.
I think so. I came from two really left-wing families in New England. I was part of two blended families, and our religious background was a mishmash of Judaism, Catholicism, and in the later years, a smattering of Zen Buddhist practices. And I learned early on to value pluralism, multiculturalism, and liberal values.
Yes, I think plurality was a good word. The plurality of human society, the need which we all have to fall back on each other, and the tendency that we have to be dependent on one another, not from a inability to care for ourselves, but just from the very nature of the buildings that we live in and the roads that we drive on and the health services that we are able to access.
Yeah, that interdependence was a big theme in our first conversation and has been a big theme in all of our conversations ever since. If anyone interviews anyone in this relationship, it's probably me. I am fascinated by the culture that you grew up in, the conservative, Christian, relatively racially homogenous town. And I think that the listeners might hear me ask a lot of questions where I'm trying to check a judgmental tone from my voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that'll be something that permeates throughout all of our podcast episodes. So I say that we formally introduce the topic today, which if you've already clicked on the episode, you know that it is regarding the book What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, which is a book by Aubrey Gordon that we have both read and thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, and somebody who we can only wish to be a fraction as charismatic and articulate as her.
Yeah. If you are unaware, Aubrey Gordon, in addition to the book we'll be discussing today, she also has a podcast called Maintenance Phase, which I would say is an expansion of her work in the book and talks further about
wellness culture
and
trends
in our 21st century society.
And we're going to be talking about the book, but before we talk about the book, we're going to be talking about disability and health, because I'm someone who has been reading fat liberation texts and engaging with fat liberation media for probably like 10 years now. A major reason why I'm really drawn to those types of voices and arguments is because I have a physical disability. A minor physical disability. I have some paralysis and deformity in my left arm and hand. And it is very minor in terms of how much it limits my physical abilities and my everyday life, but it is visible. It's a visible physical difference. And so for that reason, a lot of writing by fat activists really, really resonates with me. And I've had an appetite for more conversations about what these two demographics have in common, what these two sets of analyses have in common, and the limitations of the parallels between the two.
Yeah. And if I may add, hearing you say minor disability, I do think it's important to add that you've also done a lot to adapt to your current lifestyle and a lot of things that you've had to do to get to the point where you are today that other people may not have had to go through.
Yeah, and we'll get into what some of those things are and what my thoughts on them are. So my background is that I just have a regular job. I'm a writer at the City Teachers Union in New York.
I mean, I wouldn't call that a regular job, but okay.
It's not really a journalism job. It's a writing job. I am writing mostly in the voice of an organization and not myself. I also have a bachelor's degree in sociology and gender studies and a certificate in labor studies. So I'm coming from a social science background, and you are coming from a hard sciences background.
Well, as hard science as you can call the medical field. But yeah, I went to pharmacy school. I work in retail pharmacy. So my perspective in the pharmacy world is primarily going to be from that of a retail community pharmacist. And I'm sure that that's going to have its limitations when applied to people who are pharmacists in other sectors, whether that be the hospital pharmacy, more clinical focused pharmacy, even industrial pharmacy and research. So you wanted to start off with a discussion of the
medical and social model of disability,
which, to briefly preface them, they are sociological perspectives. Would you say that?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't credit an academic field with these theories. I think they came out of a grassroots movement.
Okay.
And I think they're sociological in that they are social theory, but I don't think that they come from sociologists. I think they come from activists. You would more likely read about them in a disability studies class than in a sociology class. Matter of fact, I never read anything explicitly about disability for my whole undergraduate education until my 4th year, when we read Stigma by Irving Goffman, and kind of had to seek out writing on disability on my own in the then thriving feminist blogosphere of the 2010s. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the medical and social model of disability, and I'm going to share a little bit about my experience with them as a disabled person. So the earliest use of these phrases that I could find in any kind of literature was from 1955. This was a psychiatrist who worked with mentally ill people, and his name was Dr. Thomas Zez. It's difficult to track the evolution of these phrases, but they became key to arguments for inclusion that eventually led to legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, the gist of it, the medical model of disability is what most people use to talk about disability. It purports that disability is an aberration that exists within an individual person. It might be an aberration in their physical body, or it might be an aberration in their brain. But it is something about a person that is atypical, and according to the medical model, it is a wrong thing. It is a bad thing. And under the medical model, the goal is to eradicate that aberration and change the individual so that they instead more closely conform to what we imagine as a typical body or brain. You might think of Autism Speaks campaigns talking about finding a cure and eliminating autism. The social model challenges that idea. It holds that variation between people is natural, and these differences only become disabling when the technology, norms, or discrimination in a society cause exclusion or limitation. An obvious example, there's a paraplegic person and they use a wheelchair to move around. Someone thinking along the lines of the medical model would be really...
A doctor.
Like a doctor. Or, a well-meaning loved one, parent, friend, would want to see that paraplegic be able to walk. And we see lots of stories about people relearning how to walk. And it's great when people can relearn how to walk. It's not always possible. And when it is possible, it's not always possible 100% of the time. The social model would advocate for ramps, elevators, wider doorways in buildings and spaces that the wheelchair user needs to move through. And so the wheelchair then becomes not disabling or limiting, but the tool that person uses to move through the world. When I was growing up, as a disabled kid, I have Erb's palsy. That's what my disability is called. I feel like it should be Hannah's palsy because Herb doesn't have it and I do, but he was the one who named it. It is an injury to a bundle of nerves in the left shoulder, and this usually happens in a birth injury, something called shoulder dystocia. If your shoulder gets dislocated while you're moving through the birth canal. The other time that you hear about people having Erb's palsy is usually motorcycle accidents. So, be careful on your motorcycles. And like I mentioned earlier, it's a visible disability. You can see that my wrist doesn't straighten, that my thumb is not opposable, that my hand and arm are smaller on the left than on the right, that I can't lift my arms all the way above my head, or my left arm rather. I can't lift it above my head. I can't put it behind my back. I can't rotate my forearm on my left side. So I would get questions about this a lot when I was a kid. And one of the questions that I would get was, is it really difficult for you? And, my instinctive answer was, no, it's not any more so than anybody else. And I had to think about why that is. And so what I would say to my friends was, what if everyone else in the world had 3 arms and you only had 2? They would probably think that's really difficult for you because they're used to having 3 arms to do everything with and you only have 2, but you wouldn't think that it's difficult because you've just only ever had 2 arms. That's just what your body is. So you always learned how to do everything with only 2 arms. And that conveyed how I felt pretty well and was a fun thought experiment. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was presenting the social model of disability. And if we take that scenario further, we can imagine that in a society where everyone has 3 arms, then all of our built spaces would be designed for people who have 3 arms. I'm trying to imagine what a kitchen would look like for somebody who had 3 arms. Our cooking implements might look different. Maybe there would be 3 nozzles on the faucet instead of 2. Definitely, it would be easier to wrangle your cat into the carrier when you have to take them to the vet, because I always say you can't possibly have enough arms for that task. So the technology and the spaces that would have been built for the 3-armed people, that would be what would be disabling to the hypothetical 2-armed person. And I think this also illustrates a big difference between what it's like for someone who has an acquired disability versus a congenital disability. Mm-hmm. I type 80 words per minute. I'm very proud of the fact that I type 80 words per minute. I do that with 6 fingers. I type with my right hand over the keyboard and my left index finger hovering over the shift key. And I just learned how to type that way. It was middle school. Everybody's social life existed over AOL Instant Messenger, where we would put up My Chemical Romance lyrics in green italics as our away messages.
Hopefully that doesn't put an age on you.
That's okay. I can have an age on me. But, I had to learn how to type. And everybody else also had to learn how to type. And that was just the method that I used to learn how to type. It was the method that was available to me. But say I hadn't gotten Erb's palsy in a birth injury, I had instead gotten it in a motorcycle accident as an adult, I would have had to relearn how to type. Yeah. I would have had to relearn how to tie my shoes, how to button up my shirt, how to brush my teeth, how to dress myself.
How to live.
How to live. So I think that's not super relevant to the social versus medical model concept, but I think it's a handy little tangent because I think that people with acquired disabilities or people who are the loved ones or caretakers of disabled people will tend to more instinctively understand this in terms of the medical model. And people with congenital disabilities, which is to say disabilities that are either part of the genetic expression of our bodies or that were acquired right at birth, will tend to identify more with the social model because we don't have an imagined other self that is non-disabled. And it is probably pretty deep into the conversation for me to issue this disclaimer, but you might have noticed that I call myself a disabled person and not a person with a disability. And there's nothing wrong with preferring to call yourself a person with a disability. I just personally prefer to call myself a disabled person. I do tend to align much more with the social model of disability. And I see disabled as an adjective like many other adjectives that apply to me, like Jewish or female or brown-haired. And I don't really see it as particularly a good or bad thing. And so I don't love what's called person-first language, because sometimes the argument in favor of person-first language is that the disability is a negative aspect to ourselves that we should distance ourselves from and instead center our personhood before the disability. That's not how I feel about my disability. I think it's just a value-neutral thing about me that I don't need to distance myself from. And so that's why you'll hear me using that language. But I would, of course, if I was talking about somebody who preferred person-first language, use the person-first language. So those are the social and medical models of disability. Can you talk about the social and medical models of health?
Absolutely. The context of the social and medical models is something that I get confused about a lot because I'm thinking about it from a medical standpoint, or at least what I learned briefly in pharmacy school. So the earliest I could find a reference to certain perspectives on health would be in a paper by Lalonde in 1974 entitled A New Perspective on the Health of Canadians. Lalonde talks about three fields of health. There's the biomedical, which is very similar to the medical model of disability that we talked about. And then there's also a environmental field and a lifestyle field. And so these aren't one for one with the medical and social model of disability, or which is why I think we had some difficulty communicating at first. But if we were to talk about the biomedical determinant of health, that would include stuff like genetics, any biology and pathophysiology that is inherent or that happens to the body. There's the environmental aspect, which looks at culture, income, education, the physical and social environment, what healthcare services are available. And then there's the lifestyle determinant of health. To me, the lifestyle and the environmental, the borders between that is a little fuzzy.
Yeah, totally, because you're going to eat way more fruits and vegetables if there are fruits and vegetables in your neighborhood. You're going to walk more if you can safely walk in your neighborhood, etc. Before you continue, there was something that I read in something that you wrote early on that was really striking to me, which was like, what is health? You were establishing a working definition for health. I don't know if it was from this Lalonde guy, but you defined health as a person's ability to fully live the life that they want to. And I think that that's a beautiful thing to keep in mind while we talk about these three categories of health, because we might not always think of health that way. We might initially think of health as like, how closely does your body and its functions conform to whatever the imagined norm or ideal is. So I think it's really great if in the medical field we can instead think about health as, to what degree are you living the life that you want to live?
Exactly. And that was kind of where I was going with this view of the different determinants of health, the medical, the environmental factors, the lifestyle factors. Ultimately, I think even on the environmental and lifestyle side, these factors tend to get subsumed into the normal, the statistical norm.
Is it the statistical norm though? Or is it just like what we...
The perceived statistical norm.
Yeah, like what we want the statistical norm to be. Because the statistical norm is actually what, like a size 14?
Yeah.
So what does that have to do with the book? A lot. You can probably tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
That a lot of the stuff that we just talked about has pretty major implications and owes a lot to fat liberation.
Yeah. I can't begin to stress enough how Aubrey Gordon's perspective, how important that is in the book. And she even says this at one point: fat people see things straight-sized people don't. And that's just kind of a fact of our reality.
You know, even though she's talking about a lot of really unfortunate realities about bigotry and systemic oppression. A lot of the things that she shares are heartbreaking, but I think when something is written beautifully in a really human voice by someone who can speak really plainly and concisely, that can be really life-affirming to read. I found it really affirming to read, and there were parts of it that I really identified with. I don't want to say or imply that all of the ink that has been spilled about fat liberation might as well have been spilled about disability liberation too, that they are one and the same. They are not. And I think a really key difference is something that she gets at pretty early on in the book, where she's talking about the implicit bias study that Harvard has had up on their website, God, since like
Early 2000s?
Early 2000s. And this implicit bias study measures people's unconscious attitude toward different identity markers. And what it has found is that over the past roughly 25 years, attitudes toward people of color, queer people, disabled people, and other marginalized groups have gotten more positive, or at least less negative, and attitudes toward fat people have gotten more negative. She also writes about how fatphobia can be used as a stand-in for racism and classism and other types of discrimination that like are not as socially acceptable anymore in their naked forms. Mm-hmm. But fatphobia is a more socially sanctioned way to hate on people in those marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. And I think disability is one of those identity markers that people wouldn't feel so comfortable just openly abhorring, but feel more comfortable if they can cloak it in contempt for fat people and fat bodies. And she even shares this really heartbreaking story in the chapter about airplane travel, mm-hmm. about somebody harassing her and asking to be moved so he won't have to sit next to her on the airplane. And, you know, how she felt experiencing that, especially after having, you know, gone through all of the preparation that she always goes through before flying, which is more than, I think, a straight-sized person like you or I ever has to think about before air travel. Yeah. And
I was, just to interject real quick, I was just flying the other day, and I was amazed at how thin the seats are. Like
oh my God, they're so small.
Yeah, I was already feeling cramped. And she goes into that in the book about how
much smaller they've gotten.
How much smaller they've gotten since the deregulation of the airline industry, mm-hmm. which is, it's something else to say about the book, that not only does she bring her experience to this, but she does good research mm-hmm. that is backed and supported by sources. And mm-hmm. there are some things that she says that I think maybe warrant a little more research. Mm-hmm. There are some things that she says from a medical standpoint that I think maybe deserve more nuance or more discussion. But for the most part, as someone who does not seemingly have a medical background, she does a very good job of parsing the evidence for and against quote unquote obesity.
Mm-hmm. And to get back to that anecdote about her being harassed on the airplane. Then. Yeah. So the guy comes up to her at the end of this flight and says, just so you know, I wouldn't have done this if you used a walker. And I think that that's a really clear example of fatphobia stepping in and taking the part of a less socially acceptable form of hate, which would be disableism. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I've yet to find a fat person or a fat writer who would begrudge disabled people, you know, are reading and identifying with their essays and articles in books. But it's not one-to-one.
Yeah.
But I think, like, we can understand the fat experience in terms of the social and medical model of disability, because one of the first buzzwords that comes up in relation to fatness is health. Mm. And I think a lot of the work of fat liberation activists is to try to communicate how much of the problem is not in their bodies, but instead in the culture and built environments that they are navigating. Mm-hmm. And even Aubrey Gordon argues pretty compellingly throughout the book, a lot of the adverse health problems can also be attributed to chronic stress or avoiding seeking out medical care because of fat phobia.
Yeah.
And I think that is really similar to what disabled people have been saying for many decades now, that the things that are wrong are not things that are wrong with us, but things that are wrong with the spaces that we are trying to move through. And that if more could be done to include us and to treat us as humans who deserve to be in public life, to physically access public spaces, that we would be far less disabled. Not disabled as a value-neutral descriptor, but disabled as like an action that is happening to us, you know?
Right.
So yeah, I really identified with that line of thinking and appreciated how well it was argued. And another thing that she took pains to say in the book, and that she takes pains to say on her podcast and in her speaking engagements, is something along the lines of, you can't love yourself out of discrimination. You can't love yourself out of systemic oppression. That because body size is something that we tend to conceive of as an issue of insecurity, that a lot of rhetoric that might market itself as fat liberation is about learning to love your body. Love your stretch marks, love your big thighs, love your jiggly arms. And that is the way to liberation and self-actualization. And she says, you know, no, if we can't get hired, if we make how much less per year than a straight-sized person? Like tens of $1,000s less per year on average.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact quote in the book. And also beyond just the decrease in salary, but the increase in medical costs, which, as we said before, can come from the lack of access to medicine, whether that be lack of access to services and even just health equipment, because hospitals and doctors' offices don't carry the appropriate equipment to be able to help these people.
Or the hoops that you have to jump through in order to get care for something that would be relatively straightforward for somebody like you and I to get care for.
Right.
Yeah, learning to love and accept yourself will not undo all of that doing.
Yeah.
And it's a similar frustration that I often feel when I try to explain that I wish I could just be treated like everybody else. I wish that people would assume competence and just know that just because I can't do things in the way that they do things, it doesn't mean I can't do them. There are other ways to do things. Yeah. And the answer I get a lot of the time, because, you know, when I'm expressing this, I'm not doing it quite so calmly, is, I don't know why you act like it's such a big deal. You just need to get over it and like learn to love and accept yourself. I've never been in a job interview where my ability to do the job was not called into question based on my disability. No amount of self-love will change that.
Right.
I've been sat down and told...
Because it has nothing to do with you.
No, it wasn't my idea. It wasn't my idea to think that there is something wrong with me because my left arm is smaller and has a smaller range of motion than my right arm, right? That idea came from other people in the world around me. The insecurity, to the degree that it ever still exists, didn't like spring forth from me. It was ingrained in me through all of these life experiences. And that's why self-love will never be the complete answer, because, and it's great, I love self-love, I do it all the time, but I can love myself so hard, and I'm still gonna be walking down the street sometime this summer wearing a tank top because it's 90 degrees, and someone's gonna stop me and ask to pray over me. Because they want God to cure what ails me. I can get to a point where that hurts less.
Yeah.
I am at a point where that hurts less.
Yeah.
I am at a point where I can laugh it off. But self-love isn't the answer to this cultural belief system that disability is something wrong with a person that must be eradicated. self-love is also not the answer to this cultural belief system that says that fatness is something wrong with a person that must be eradicated.
Yeah.
And both of those statements can be hard for people to hear because they think of disability as something that inherently shortens the length of your life and detracts from your quality of life. And they think of fatness the same way. And not only is that not true, fatness and disability, neither of them inherently lower your quality of life or shorten the length of your life. But also, even if they did, even if being disabled meant that you have a shorter lifespan and you can do less things with your one wild and precious life, even if being fat meant that, why would that mean that we should treat people as less than? And that's something that you've shared some ideas with me about.
In terms of?
The just world fallacy.
Yeah.
But you've shared, maybe without the phrase the just world fallacy, but you've talked about this Christian worldview. Whatever is typical, whatever is ideal, is thought of in this worldview as the natural state of things and therefore morally good. And so if something is abnormal and differs from the ideal, then it must indicate that there was a moral failing somewhere along the line. And what I said in response was that I think it's really easy to fall into that line of thinking because the feeling of disgust feels as if it's so ingrained. It's just a reflex within your body, like hunger or thirst. When actually disgust is a learned reaction. And people might feel disgust for someone whose gender presentation doesn't align with what they expect, somebody whose body has more fat on it than the observer wants it to, or somebody who has a visible limb difference or deformity. All of these things might invoke a disgust reaction, a learned disgust reaction. And the line of thinking might be, well, this disgust reaction must be because I'm observing something that is unnatural and bad. And I will say to any listeners what I also said to you, Sam, on our first date, which is you should listen to Maintenance Phase.
It's another place that Aubrey Gordon
shines
and shares her thoughts. I would say, because I know personally with podcasts, that it can take some time for me to get invested in a podcast. So I would argue that if you read the book and you like the book, then I would highly recommend the podcast. Just knowing that sometimes it's hard to start a podcast on a random episode and get deep into it. Whereas if you read the book first, you'll have an idea of her perspective, and the podcast would just provide more of that.
Man, you and I are so different. I find it so much easier to start with a podcast than to get through a book.
Well, is that not just a perfect example, encapsulation of everything we just talked about?
Yeah, because people's brains can work differently, and it doesn't mean that one way is better than the other.
Yeah. So how do we love in a society, Hannah? How should we take everything we've just talked about and apply it to our lives going out into the world?
I hope that this is something that I practice in my life, but I think that we can always re-examine and double down on these types of values, which is if somebody's body looks a way that you don't expect a body to look like, don't worry about it, man. You're fine. You don't need to ask for justification. You don't need to resolve any tension about that. You can just notice it and then move on with your day. Or not notice it. You could simply not scan people's bodies for aberrations and flaws. But if you do notice something unusual about someone's body, just remind yourself that you're safe. You don't need to resolve any discomfort. You don't need an explanation. You're fine. Likewise, if somebody's body differs from the norm or ideal in some visible way, and another person is being mean to them about it, step in. Be a pal. Aubrey Gordon suggests all kinds of great ways that you can be an ally to your fat loved ones. She talks about being mindful of seating in restaurants, making sure that you scope out places that people can easily get into, leave the chair with more room for your fat friend. And, if you see some dude harassing a fat lady on an airplane, tell him that he's being a jerk.
Yeah.
Or harassing somebody with a walker. You can also tell him that he's being a jerk.
Yeah. I would very much agree. I don't think there are necessarily evil or bad people who are just looking for the bad. As we've discussed, it's conditioned into us. And so it's work. And it may feel uncomfortable at first to notice something that makes you feel uncomfortable and not do anything to release the tension, like you said. But it is so very important for the people that we live amongst that we're not trying to stigmatize people. And one of the first ways that people get stigmatized is by their difference being highlighted.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I wanted to say about how we can love in a society, and this is applicable to everyone, whether you may be fat, whether you may be straight sized, whether you may be thin, whether you're younger or older, is to go back to that first part of the podcast when we were talking about health and how we define health. And this is something I've really honed in on the past year, is I don't want to see health as a virtue. I don't want to see health as something that I cultivate necessarily or something that is moral.
Yeah, I want to see it as something that I cultivate, but, because I want to be able to do stuff like carry my groceries upstairs to my apartment.
Yeah.
Or stay out all night dancing at a mid-aughts dance party on the Lower East Side because I am, again, old. But not because I think it makes me morally pure or morally superior to other people, and certainly not because I think that it fulfills my quota for good deeds for the day if I work out or eat a salad. It does not.
Yeah. Health is the ability to live your life, and living your life is something we each kind of figure out. There's obviously going to be a lot of similarities between people, between what they need, and some of that can come from an objective scientific standpoint, but a lot of it is going to be affected by the culture and society and community that you grow up in, and some of it is going to be self-determined. There might be things important to me.
Like climbing a wall made of plastic rocks.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
I'm not going to try that hard to climb walls made of plastic rocks, but I love it for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that sense, health for us can look slightly different, but I think...
I want a great big butt. And so maybe instead of climbing the wall of plastic rocks, I will be holding weights and squatting.
I can't imagine a better way to reach that goal.
And I hope that more medical care providers can adopt that attitude that you're describing, that health is a person's ability to live the life that they want. And so that involves understanding who they are as an individual and what their goals are and what makes them happy, and also advocating for a world that makes space for all kinds of people.
Yeah, again, to refer back to Aubrey Gordon's book, she spends at least a chapter, if not two, on the subject of what we would more typically call health, her interaction with the medical field, and what she would call on all medical providers to do. And as crazy as it seems, from such a seemingly caring profession, there's a lot of fat discrimination that comes directly from the medical community and is justified and held up by the medical community. And I think that might be more than we would discuss today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for spending some time talking to me about how we can better love the people around us.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sitting down to talk with me as well. And I am really looking forward to this becoming a consistent thing.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about the substance.
Yes.
I love you, Sam.
I love you, Hannah.
You can take out the part about how I want a big butt, so I'm trying to grow my glutes.